Forensic Fantastic, a conversation between Oscar Guardiola-Rivera and Gerald Martin. Gerald Martin's fascination with Latin America began when he was a child, but took its first concrete form through reading when he was 16. While studying A-level Spanish in the early 1960s, he read a novel called Pensativa by an unknown Mexican novelist, Jesus Goytortua. One might call it a beautiful accident. Back then, it was unknown for a Latin American novel to be one of the key set texts in A-level Spanish. I thought it was marvelous, Gerald says. Maybe it wasn't really, but I was already an enormous Latin American enthusiast. Really since childhood. Who knows why? In retrospect, he tells me, I've been a sort of Latin American in my imagination for most of my life. You might say I don't belong anywhere because I was born in London, and yet by the 1980s I had not only visited every Latin American country and lived in two of them, but was frequently perceived in England as having gone quite native. Latin American literature has been my lifelong interest. I've never been disillusioned or disappointed with it. It's given me a fantastic life, Gerald tells me in conversation. Gerald wrote Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A Life, published in 2008 and then translated into more than 30 languages. It is considered the definitive biography of the Colombian Nobel Prize winner, who was Latin America's most recognizable magical realist. Now, the 79-year-old Andrew Mellon Emeritus Professor of Modern Languages at Pittsburgh University and London Met joins Carlos Aguirre, Javier Munguia, and Augusto Wong in co-editing the forensically precise yet marvelously arranged collection of letters penned by the four key members of the Latin American literary boom of the 1960s. From the second half of the 20th century, Carlos Fuentes, Julio Cortázar, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez put the region not only on the world's literary map, but into the mainstream, to quote Chilean critic Luis Hars, who is supposed to have coined the label The Boom in 1967. Entitled The Boom Letters, Las Cartas del Boom, this explosive combination of the fantastic and the forensic is the subject of our conversation.
Okay. I am Gerald Martin. My only real title now is an emeritus one. I am the Andrew W. Mellon Professor Emeritus of Modern Languages in the University of Pittsburgh. Though after Pittsburgh, I also had a position for 6 years in London Metropolitan University as well. So at last in my life, I finally had a job in London, which, although being a Londoner, I never actually managed to do before. That was nice. I have been working on Latin America in one sense since I was 16, in the sense that I studied A-level Spanish, and immediately Latin America was my main interest. We only had one book on the syllabus that was Latin American, and that was a miracle in those days, which was a novel called Pensativa, which I thought was absolutely marvelous, although it was actually absolutely terrible. But I was already an enormous Latin American enthusiast. So at my very advanced age now, I've actually been a Latin Americanist for probably about 64 years. It's been my main interest for 64 years, I would say. I have never ever been even slightly disillusioned with it or disappointed with it. It's been a fantastic life. I don't belong anywhere because I don't really. And the Latin Americans know that how much some of them may like me and approve of me. I don't belong there. And of course, I certainly don't belong here because I am generally perceived as having gone quite native and having worked for and in and from Latin America rather than from here. So, of course, you're going through something similar yourself in another way, but I won't try and guess what you do. I'd just like to say two things before we get started, because they occurred to me just before this began, and I find myself distracted. You and I are here talking on a Zoom kind of, probably going to get in trouble with Microsoft now. They'll send me anyway, something like a Zoom thing, Teams, and it underlines something about the job that I've done with these three friends, which has been done overwhelmingly through email for a long time now. And I'm going to explain that later when you ask me a question that requires me to answer it. But just to say two things, I've mentioned this a couple of times in previously in conversations and publications, but it does strike me as really very significant. My biography, I've written two biographies, well, almost written two. I've certainly written 1 3/4. The biography of Garcia Marquez was entirely a trekking around the world biography, a writing letters biography, and techniques that we've been using for a long, long time. Mainly my interviews, I didn't even record them. I just went in, did the interview, and wrote what I could remember about it later on. Americans are horrified that that's the way I behave, but that's what Gubbo always did, and I decided to do it like Gubbo. So, although I had a strange kind of free existence traveling around doing things, I also needed an institution, a university. I needed university libraries to do the backup stuff. You had to have actual books, and you had to actually go in and read those books in the library. You had to have reference books because there was no Google. And so that was one kind of biography. And then when I started the Mario Vargas Llosa biography, which was a couple of years after Garcia Marquez, I was retired. I live in this rural town, really, in England. It's only an hour from London, but you can't go going up to London all the time to go to libraries. And so I could not possibly have done this biography of Vargas Llosa if it hadn't been the era of all kinds of digitality. So it's a completely different experience. Most of it's been done remotely. Of course, I've been to Peru several times, as I'll explain later. But it's a completely different experience, and it could not have been done in this way in any other period in history. So I've done two biographies, the one really quite traditional, not that different. No, there weren't jet planes, but not that different from Boswell and Johnson. You know, you go and see the guy and you talk to him and you talk to his friends and you travel around a bit to do it and so on. I've done that kind of biography, and now I'm doing this extraordinary remote biography. So that's the first thing. We're in a very particular era, and the reason why I'm saying that is that for contemporary men, which is another theme of this, for contemporary men have researched and edited the letters of 4 other men who lived in a different period, which was the beginning of our period, really, in many respects. And they waited for the postman and all the rest of it, for Il Postino, and they had to wait until the letters crossed the Atlantic. Even though they went fairly quickly, letters were still crossing one another and so on. Whereas the 4 people who've edited this book have done it with all the advantages of contemporary technology, and so we email each other all the time. We're in contact most days and can be in contact whenever we want to. And even if we want to do things like this Zoom, I never do, but they occasionally do it. But mainly, we've still done it by correspondence, but by email. And that's kind of the whole historical technological background to the whole of this book. I could probably have said it later, but I probably would have forgotten, so I've said it now.
It's a beautiful thing, Gerald, and to remark the difference that in the relatively short period of time that separates us from these 4 writers, Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, so many and so profound changes have occurred. And the one you remark upon is very important, as we will learn in the course of this conversation, the difference in between technologies, the difference in the way in which our communicating vessels operate. Let us perhaps, dive into precisely this matter of communication vessels, and let me remind us of the words that the four of you use in your, may I say, fantastic introduction to present and define or conceptualize the boom. This word that encompasses the work, times, and thoughts of these four men that you referred to. The words you have chosen, I think, are very, very significant and totally non-coincidental. In order to describe the boom, you use the following set of words: moment, movement, group, club, fellowship, alliance, play, sparring and conflict, debate, party, apotheosis, a debating quartet, or kin. Is there a particular reason why you have chosen these words precisely?
I have always felt that the boom, I mean, I'm speaking for myself and partly speaking for the others, and of course, it goes without saying that four different people involved in Latin American affairs will rarely agree about everything, and we certainly didn't agree about everything, though we did agree. There's a phrase we now use because this was discussed, even fought out, so all the sparring's taken place in a meta way at a distance with all of us. There is a phrase we've all used: the four are the four. It's a ludicrous phrase, but it's a phrase that has saved a great many arguments, because discussions of the boom have always been vitiated by, on the one hand, vagueness, and on the other hand, by the fact that it was a literary conjuncture at the moment of a historical conjuncture, which doesn't always happen. Often the literary conjuncture comes later and the historical conjuncture comes first, sometimes the other way around. But anyway, the boom has always raised all kinds of questions, and it's been an incredible, always a fascinating kind of jumble. But I felt anyway, I have particularly felt that there needed to be a kind of focus, not a focus which would give us a definitive view of what the boom was, of course, because that doesn't happen in either literary studies or history, but at least as to what the terms are, what it's about, what is relevant, what isn't relevant, who were the more important authors, why isn't Carpentier a member of the boom, and all these kinds of things. We all felt that these letters, which we gradually got to see at different times in different places over a period of time, when they all came out together, would solve a lot of problems. So what I think the letters show is what I always thought, which is that these were four very different writers who managed to have what was definitely, and it's quite a rare thing, it's definitely not something that happens as easily these days, which is that it was a friendship. It was a friendship which was also a rivalry. You could think of the Four Musketeers with the D'Artagnan, and it's obvious who he would be in the boom, and that would be Vargas Llosa, because he was the youngest and the noisiest and the most personally insistent about everything, and he's still there. We've got a D'Artagnan probably in our group as well. It's not me. So what I think is quite moving at times is the way in which there is a rivalry, in which there is a tension, in which people disagree, but in which they nevertheless manage to have a friendship. So there is a friendship at the center of this, but that friendship is nevertheless a competitive friendship, and it's also competitive in a particular way, which is each of these friends had to discard other friends in order to be the friends they were of the other three. In other words, one of the things that we stress in the introduction, and it's a word that I mentioned, and someday somebody will probably write a book about this, I hope, is the theme of recognition. If you go through the letters, what you see is a constant act and atmosphere of recognition. These people recognize that the important novelists of their generation, of their moment, are themselves and the other three, and that other people, although maybe even possibly more brilliant, don't fit with the boom categories that we've, in a kind of satirical way, divided into four, because the whole book is about four. So we've joked about groups of four, and of course it was the period of all the rock groups, and four was the normal number for them as well, and we've done it with the boom as well. So it's what I find moving about this, and funnily enough, a friend of mine who also knows a lot about the boom, whom I've been talking to since the book came out, Richard John King, he also says that he's found it really moving to see them talking to one another, sparring with one another, agreeing and disagreeing, mainly agreeing, of course. You've got to be careful, especially when you're writing at a distance. But the combination of competition and at the same time identification under the sign of this word that I've used, recognition, is something that I find really interesting. It rarely happens. It almost never happens that you get four equals. That's very, very unusual. We say at the beginning that any of these could have won the Nobel Prize, if that's a measure of anything, and let's say for the moment it is. Fuentes was less likely to win it, but if he'd been from some other region, he might have won it. Certainly Cortázar could have won the Nobel Prize. It would have been a bit of an off, bohemian thing to do, but he could. And the other two did. And they all recognized that kind of thing in each other. But also behind that, we come to the next point, which is that whatever one thinks of the politics of these four people, they were all, Cortázar was just becoming it, but they were all political. By the time Cortázar was writing Rayuela, he was outgrowing Rayuela and becoming something else. It's very interesting to see, because he was the oldest of them. And there's also the politics, and with politics, of course, there is always sparring, there is always fencing, there is always backwards and forwards, there is always the competition, and in the end, of course, it did destroy the group. They tried hard for it not to destroy them, as a matter of fact, and you could talk for a long time whether Mario Vargas Llosa's punch was really about a supposed sexual misstep, or whether it was actually much more political. We don't know. But what we do know is in the first instance, those writers did actually try to keep going with their relationship despite the politics, something that I've always found quite difficult, but one tries. And so those words apply both to the literary and to the political dimensions as well as the personal dimensions. And I think we were very aware of all those dimensions as we worked on this.
It is precisely that convergence between these two dimensions, the literary and the political, that becomes more and more interesting as one reads the letter. I received the book late last night and haven't stopped. In fact, I haven't slept that much just because of the power of these two dimensions coming together through the recognition, the reciprocal recognition of these two fellows. And I'm sure that whomever writes the book that you mentioned before will focus on one particular word out of the ones we have just mentioned. And that one is fellowship, particularly if the person writing that book comes from an Anglo-Saxon provenance. It may have been one of those wonderful accidents, but I happened to be reading William Morris, and the centrality of that concept, which is both aesthetic and political, as Morris himself puts it, is something that palpitated and indeed affected me thoroughly as I read the letters.
I have found it very moving, and as I told you, I've heard from my good friend about it, and he has too, and he has now finished the book and says that he feels orphaned. And I think the reason for that is the word you're using, because I do think that it is very moving to see people with different backgrounds, different issues, different ambitions, different politics, different aesthetics, to see them nevertheless holding on as best they can. And they do, talking of fellowship, they do quite a number of times, 2 or 3 of them, but especially Garcia Marquez, use the word hermano, which again is quite moving in its way at this distance and in a political sense. So I agree with you completely. Yes, I do agree that that's a really important word. And
one might even take the resonance with Morris's concept of fellowship to say that these 4 men managed to build a universal republic, as opposed to the republican universalism of each of their 4 countries. And that's indeed, this is the next step in your collective definition of the boom. The fact that each one of the 4 writers went to consider themselves Latin American, cross and beyond being Peruvian, Colombian, Argentinian, and Mexican.
Yeah, I of course, being old, and having also studied somebody, these writers were Garcia Marquez and Fuentes were about 15 to 17 years older than me. Previously, however, I'd studied Miguel Ángel Asturias, the Guatemalan, who was 45 years older than me. And so I had spent a lot, he was more or less from my grandparents' generation, almost, not quite. And so I'd studied the 1920s in Latin America and in Paris. And so this experience that has happened so often of Latin Americans meeting, particularly in Paris, in Europe, of course, as a whole, but in Paris particularly, and discovering that they were Latin Americans there, is something that had happened in the 1920s. Asturias had first begun to experience it when the students all went to Mexico in 1921 for an enormous student congress, just 3 years after the Cordova student movement. And when he got to Paris and found even more Latin Americans there, they all suddenly realized that And I think one of the things that's happened since the Second World War is that this particular group we're talking about did indeed spend a lot of time in Paris, all of them. Paris is the more unifying thing for them than Barcelona, as a matter of fact. And went through exactly that same. It's amazing how it has to keep happening in Latin America. And of course, as a Bolivarian, as I've always been, not particularly of the recent kind, but in general, I have always wished that Latin America was one federal republic with a capital somewhere, or even with a rotating capital, where Latin Americans could all meet one another. They have met, so they meet in Latin America, in Paris, so much. It tends to be in Spain. And of course, that's a different kind of realization that you're Latin American, and one that cannot be separated from the whole Hispanic culture thing, which is actually, in this case, it's an estorbo. It gets in the way of feeling your Latin Americanness, because after all, you're very like Spaniards. You speak the same language. You've read a lot of the same literature. You've got a lot of things in common, apparently and theoretically. And it's not the same as going to Paris. So yes, that's a really important theme in the book. And you can see them, even though these are people who already know. Garcia Marquez has made that discovery in the 1950s. Cortas has made that discovery from the early 1950s. Fuentes, of course, total cosmopolitan, has made. You see them realizing it even more. And for two reasons. One, that their conversation is a very high level, though also low level, demanding conversation. And secondly, of course, Cuba. Cuba is there at the beginning of the decade. Cuba does have that ambition to become, if not the capital of Latin America, certainly its focus. It does establish a cultural institution called Casa de las Americas, and it gives a different kind of focus. All these guys already know about the Parisian connection, plus the Spanish connection, because two of them at least lived in Spain. But it gives an extra edge to that, a political edge.